Hey everyone, I'm going to talk today about Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, which is a new book from Jason Staples and Cambridge. I'm going to take you through my typical review format, and just heads up, this is going to probably be an enthusiastic review. I'm just going to say that right at the outset, but I'm going to break down the main idea of the book, the research behind it, the readability, the style, and then just my reactions as a whole, which you'll get a sense of as I talk about all those different areas. But let's jump into it. So Paul and the Resurrection of Israel is on the surface of it, it's a Pauline theology. It's a theology of Paul's writings. But what it actually is, I would argue it's actually more of a fully biblical theology because of the scope of kind of what he's referencing here. But the main idea of this book, there's kind of one really significant plank of his argument here. So he's trying to pose a reading of Paul and trying to pose a lens through which you can look at Paul's writings in the New Testament, especially the book of Romans. Galatians is also talked about too. But the one main idea is this. It's so simple, but it is kind of a lightning bolt revelation as well. And that idea is this. This first plank in the argument is that the terms in the biblical and kind of language and writings of antiquity around biblical literature, around that 1st, 2nd century Jewish writings especially, the terms Israel and the terms Jew or Judea are not the same. They're not meaning the same thing. So when Scripture talks about becoming a Jew or talks about the Jews, and then when Scripture talks about Israel, they're talking about not the same thing. That's one of his most important, emphatic, kind of first pieces of his argument. So Israel, in his argument, refers to the entirety of the 12 tribes that were in the land of promise in the biblical narrative, whereas Judea was one of the 12 tribes. And so to be a Jew in the time of Paul's writing was to be from that particular subset of Israel, but Israel as a whole was much bigger than that. And in the biblical history, in the historical narrative, most of Israel was lost to exile, lost to destruction from Assyria, and the hope, the eschatological end times restorationist hope was that all of Israel would be brought back together one day. This, he argues, is an extremely important way to see Paul's writing through this whole lens, that all of Israel being restored, and then the Jews currently in the day of Paul's writings did not represent all of Israel. They were one part of Israel. And so he goes to great pains to kind of disambiguate those terms in the writings, and he goes to great pains to back that up, which I'll talk about in the research section. But that's one of the most important kind of things he does here. But the rest of what he does is then with that argument in place, he approaches a very close reading of Romans, particularly the beginning of Romans, those first few chapters, and then those notorious chapters 9 through 11, in which Paul talks about the rest of all of Israel being saved and God's promises to Israel never failing, and the potter and the clay imagery. I mean, he approaches the vessels of wrath. He approaches head on all of these notoriously difficult texts to interpret in Romans with this lens in place, and it is remarkable what he does with them. In my view, it's remarkable how he reads them, and the argument that he makes is so compelling. So he essentially makes this argument that with the eschatological hope in place to restore Israel one day, that his argument is essentially that Paul is saying through Romans and Galatians, at the time he's writing, he's trying to tell the people that he is writing to that is precisely what God is accomplishing. God is accomplishing the full restoration of Israel by giving God's Spirit to these Gentiles. And the background of that argument is that, well, I'll get more into the background of the argument in a minute, but that's essentially what he is arguing, that Paul is arguing in his letters, is that the restoration of Israel is happening in that day by the fact that these Jews are giving the Spirit of God and they're becoming part of the people of God, which is Israel, not Judea, but Israel kind of holistically. I'll pause my ramblings about the main idea there. That gives you some taste of where he's going with this book, and it's just remarkable. It's a remarkable book. Okay, let me get into some of these next areas before I get hung up on that too much. The research behind this is just outstanding research, and I'm going to say a few things about that. So first of all, I said this is a biblical theology in that he reaches deeply into the Deuteronomic texts, especially Deuteronomy figures large here, but he also reaches through a lot of the prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah in particular. So there's he looks through the Torah but really leans on Deuteronomy especially. But there's a kind of a wide swath of the biblical literature that he pulls on, and it's really, really close exegetical work there. It's very, very close exegetical work with the Greek in Romans in particular. But there's another area of research that is really helpful, and that's the secondary ancient literature. So he talks a lot about sources like Josephus, for example, but the extant writings outside of the biblical kind of corpus, that are like contemporaneous with it. He has a really, really strong kind of command of those, and so that's part of how he builds his argument about the distinction between the terms of Israel and Jew, especially as they were used at the time. And that's what's really compelling. Like, he makes very strong arguments about the kind of does word studies and does like, here's the number of times the word Israel is used versus the term Jew is used in these contexts. He explains the cultural background of the Samaritans with some of that extra textual evidence. So he really, it's a wide range of mastery of texts, including the biblical scriptural account, but outside of it as well, to kind of buttress the case that he's making. So just outstanding, a massive amount of footnotes on basically every page. Oh, also one other thing I want to say is he is really well versed in Pauline studies currently, so he interacts with Douglas Campbell, N.T. Wright, E.P. Sanders, all the old and new John Piper, the so-called old and new perspective people, Stephen Westerholm. I'll keep thinking of names if I keep talking, but he interacts with all of them, and he challenges where he needs to challenge. He affirms what he agrees with, but he really challenges a lot of people around all sides of this kind of conversation. So, but he demonstrates, I think, a very fair reading of the current interpreters, the landscape of Paul's theology. Okay, so that gets me into the readability. Now, this is going to really vary depending on who you are. There's a lot of close exegetical stuff here. The Greek text is like talked about. There's tons of massive footnotes on each page. It's very academic. This reads like this is basically a seminary textbook. So I found it very readable because I was so engaged in the argument, and I was so just wrapped up in where he was going with it. I've also read a lot of the at least secondary people like N.T. Wright and Stephen Westerholm and whatnot. I've read a good bit of those, enough to kind of know when he had a footnote and was interacting with an argument. James Dunn is another one. I knew enough to know kind of what he's doing there, so I didn't have to be constantly kind of ping-ponging and trying to wrap my mind around the state of all these arguments. So I didn't find those things to be barriers. I'm saying all that to say that you might find them to be barriers depending on your level of comfort or conversancy with that literature. So your mileage is very much going to vary there. But if you know that landscape, if you know the old and new perspective writings in general, and if you have a little bit of Greek, I don't really think you need a lot of Greek. My Greek is not great. But if you have at least a little bit of it, if you went to seminary ages ago or something, I don't think any of this is going to be barriers for you. But if you are like completely jumping in cold with all that, this might hit you over the head. I'm not sure. So I'm trying to be measured there in the readability thing. I just like gobbled this book up. So if you watch my reviews enough, you kind of know the type of stuff I read, then hopefully you can figure out whether this might be too advanced for you or not. Okay, I want to include a little section here that I included for my review of Lamb of the Free, which is some things that I learned, just to keep whetting your appetite, and then I'll get to my general reactions. So here's a few things that I learned. First of all, that difference between Israel and Jew, super important. I learned a lot about the language of the Torah being on the heart. That's a really, really big theme through all of this. I learned a lot more about what that means in the context here. I learned a lot about what the term exile means. And I actually have it's nuanced my understanding of N.T. Wright's use of the term exile and the kind of the state of the Jewish conception of exile after the certain tribes returned from exile in Babylon, but not the rest of them. I learned a lot about why the claim of Samaritan status as Jew was so contentious at the time. This gives you a lot more context for what's going on there in terms of those cultural tensions and the hoped for restoration of Israel. And oh my gosh, his reading of Romans, like my understanding of Romans, is wildly stretched. Couple examples. That terminology in Romans 1 about people knowing God and not having any excuse for turning away from God. I see that completely differently than I've always heard it presented. I've always heard it presented as some kind of natural law argument, but because of this book and because of his argument, I've now shifted to agreeing with him and thinking that that's actually talking about the Jews who broke the covenant, the tribes who were lost. They had no excuse because they had the covenant and they still were lost. That's one example. I learned a whole lot about the language of vessels of wrath, that and the language about the God working with the potter, God working with the clay as a potter works with clay. That analogy means something very different to me after reading this book. One major insight that I gained from this is his contention that essentially, so this is Staples' contention. This is his argument that what Paul is arguing is that essentially what happened is the vast majority of Israel became Gentiles. So those 10 lost tribes became gentilized, is his term. They became Gentiles. And so theologically then, what God needed to do to bring the people back, to restore Israel fully, was to go to Gentiles, because the tribes became Gentiles. And then he goes to Gentiles to make them the people of God. I mean, that, especially if you grew up in evangelical Protestantism with the kind of old traditional perspective on Paul, like, this idea is just a complete paradigm explosion. Hence my enthusiasm for it. So, and then the last thing I'll say about what I learned was about putting Romans 9-11 in the context of all of this, like the way that all just falls into place. And I guess I'll say one more thing, the implications that has for the supersessionistic tension, which is something I've always struggled with, is how do you think about the church becoming the people of God without being a supersessionist, as in replacing Israel. This book solves that. It honestly kind of solves that, which is a little bit of a crazy thing to say because that seems like such an intractable debate in biblical studies and theology, but I feel like this book just solves that problem, honestly. So, okay, those are some things I learned. I'll just give a few words of reaction at the end here. Not that you need me to at this point. You've already gleaned my view on this book, but in 2024, this is vaulting up on the list of the most important theology books I've read this year. I think it's going to vie for Lamb of the Free. Lamb of the Free might still be my favorite theology book of the year so far, but this one is really vying for that spot. It's easily in the top 3 books on Paul, I've ever read in my whole life. It's that good. It's that well-researched, even outside of the biblical text. It's such a close exegetical argument, and it's like confident and like works you through very kind of systematically works through his argument in a way that's just I found it utterly compelling and so persuasive in the particulars of it that I am now waiting kind of with bated breath to see what responses to this book are, because I feel like I wonder if this could be a kind of a watershed or a sea change book in Pauline studies. And I think that it is complementing so much of what I've read before, but it's making so much of what I've read before make so much more sense. And so I loved this book. Easily 5 stars, full top rating from me. This is, again, one of the best theology books that I've read this year, and one of the best books on Paul I've ever read, actually. That is Paul and the Resurrection of Israel by Jason Staples. Fantastic, essential reading for wrapping your mind around Paul and wrapping your mind around the landscape of Paul's interpretations today. Just outstanding, superb book. So there's some enthusiasm for you. If you're not intrigued yet, I don't know what'll make you intrigued. But if you're the kind of person that wants to read and understand Paul or understand Romans better, got to get this book. Highest recommendation for me. Those are my thoughts. As always, thank you for taking some time to watch.